I wasn't on the hunt for giants when I began my research into Siberian logging operations. My focus was investigating labor practices in pre-Soviet Russia, work crews, logging camps, the industrial extraction that drove imperial expansion. It was standard historical research, the type you organize into tidy tables of production quotas and labor statistics before moving forward. Then I discovered the photographs. Not sketches, not folklore drawings, not exaggerated stories from trappers swapping tales by campfires. Actual photographs. Real photographic evidence spanning the 1880s through the early 1900s, depicting work crews in Siberian forests with individuals of impossible proportions standing alongside regular-sized loggers. Their scale was so dramatic, it seemed like some kind of perspective illusion, except these weren't tricks. The depth of field remained consistent throughout. Snow patterns aligned perfectly. Shadows fell accurately across every figure. These images came from an era before sophisticated photo manipulation existed, and that's when the official explanations started falling apart. As I dug deeper, more photographs surfaced. Glass plate negatives from Russian imperial archives, albums and prints from French expeditions, gelatin silver prints revealing men, primarily men, though occasionally women, standing 9, 10, sometimes 11 feet tall against the frozen Siberian landscape. These weren't isolated curiosities or single medical anomalies preserved for scientific study. Entire groups appeared, multiple individuals captured in the same frame, part of the same work crew, the same logging camp, sometimes 3 or 4 giants working among a crew of 20 normal-sized men. Russian state archives contain dozens of these images. The French National Library houses a collection from scientific expeditions that mention them only briefly, local workers of unusual stature, then move forward without any investigation. Swedish logging companies operating in the region maintained meticulous records, including photographs of their work crews, and there they are again. Individuals towering over their colleagues, gripping the same tools, wearing identical winter gear, performing the same labor. The pattern never varies. Document, catalog, never investigate. Never question why. Why were so many concentrated in Siberian logging operations? Why do the photographs cluster between 1870 and 1910, then suddenly stop? Why do expedition journals describe these individuals not as curiosities, but as valued workers, stronger, more capable, specifically recruited for the heaviest labor? And here's what makes dismissal impossible. These giants aren't posed for spectacle. They're caught mid-task. Photographs reveal them operating saws, moving logs, standing in work formations alongside their crews. The images weren't created to showcase anomalies. They were documenting logging operations, and the giants just happened to be there, unremarkable enough that photographers felt no need to explain their presence. Once you recognize it, the evidence multiplies exponentially. I began examining the logging equipment itself. 2-man crosscut saws from Siberian operations measure 12 to 16 feet in length, far longer than comparable saws used in European or American logging during the same era. The standard historical explanation? Designed for exceptionally large Siberian timber. Except Siberian trees, while substantial, aren't proportionally bigger than old-growth forests in North America or Scandinavia, which utilized significantly smaller saws, unless the men operating them weren't standard-sized. The saw handles themselves reveal the truth. Grip spacing on these antique tools, still located in museum collections and rural Russian salvage yards, measures 40 to 50 inches apart. A normal-sized man with average arms can't comfortably operate a saw with handles spaced that distance. You'd have to fully extend both arms, eliminating any mechanical advantage, rendering the tool essentially useless. But for someone 9 feet tall with proportional arm length, the spacing becomes perfectly ergonomic. Then there are the sleds. Massive timber transport sleds discovered abandoned in remote Siberian regions, some still half buried in permafrost. These aren't sleds designed for moving processed lumber to mills. These are field sleds built to drag fresh-cut logs from cutting sites to staging areas. The construction mirrors standard logging sleds, except scaled up by nearly double. The pulling harnesses measure 7 feet from shoulder mount to load attachment point. The structural load capacity suggests weights requiring a dozen horses to move, or several exceptionally strong men. Museums display these as ceremonial sleds or parade equipment, despite obvious wear patterns, despite the fact they're found in working forest regions dozens of miles from any settlement large enough to hold parades. The alternative, that they were functional equipment built for human operators of unusual size and strength, apparently doesn't warrant consideration. But it's not just equipment, it's the camps themselves. Abandoned logging camps throughout the Siberian taiga contain architectural anomalies mirroring the patterns I've documented elsewhere. Bunkhouse doorways standing 10 to 12 feet high. Sleeping platforms built 36 inches off the ground, far too elevated for a normal person to comfortably sit on the edge and lie down. Eating tables with benches positioned at heights that would leave average-sized men's feet dangling. Not in one camp, in dozens. Contemporary records from Russian forestry operations describe these camps as temporary structures built quickly, rebuilt seasonally as logging operations relocated. Yet they consistently feature the same oversized proportions. Why would crews building temporary shelters in brutal Siberian conditions deliberately waste lumber and labor constructing everything larger than necessary, unless it wasn't larger than necessary for the people using it? The photographic evidence becomes impossible to ignore when you examine it systematically. In image after image, you see the same configuration. A work crew lined up for documentation, standard practice for logging operations tracking their workforce. 10, 15, 20 men, and among them, consistently, individuals towering over their colleagues. Not standing on stumps, not positioned on uneven ground, standing on the same snow-packed earth as everyone else, their heads rising 3, sometimes 4 feet above the men beside them. The clothing is identical. Same winter coats, same fur hats, same heavy boots. These aren't visiting dignitaries or supervisors in different attire. They're dressed for the same labor and the same conditions. The only difference is scale and their hands. You can see it clearly in the higher quality photographs. Hands holding axe handles, gripping saw frames, resting on the shoulders of shorter colleagues. Hands proportional to their bodies, which means hands the size of dinner plates. Not swollen from disease, not deformed, just scaled up. Everything in proportion, just fundamentally larger. What makes these photographs devastating to conventional explanations is their mundane nature. These aren't circus posters advertising the tallest man in Russia. These aren't medical documentation of pathological cases. These are workplace photographs, logging crew rosters, the visual equivalent of punching a time clock. The giants are simply there, part of the crew, unremarkable enough that no one bothered noting their presence in the captions, as if 9-foot-tall men in Siberian logging crews were completely normal. The French expeditions provide the most detailed documentation precisely because they weren't looking for giants. They were surveying Siberian resources and labor practices for commercial purposes. An 1891 expedition report describes encountering a logging operation near the Yenisei River, employing what they called indigenous workers of extraordinary physical development. The account is clinical, almost dismissive. Several individuals of exceptional height, estimated between 2.7 and 3.2 meters, performing heavy timber work with efficiency exceeding normal laborers. Foreman indicated such workers commonly employed throughout the region for tasks requiring significant strength. 3 meters, nearly 10 feet tall. The report doesn't sensationalize this, doesn't express shock or disbelief, just notes it as an observed fact and moves on to discussing timber quality and transportation logistics, as if encountering multiple 10-foot-tall loggers was interesting, but not particularly unusual. The photographs accompanying that expedition show exactly what the report describes: massive individuals among standard-sized crews, mid-work, unremarkable. Then the records stop. After approximately 1912, these photographs disappear from Russian archives. Not gradually, abruptly. The detailed expedition reports cease. The logging company rosters that previously noted crew composition stop mentioning workers of unusual stature. The glass plate negatives that documented daily operations suddenly show only normal-sized men. What changed? Not the logging operations. Siberian timber extraction continued and expanded. Not photographic technology. Cameras became more common and accessible. Not the workers themselves. There's no evidence of mass emigration or population collapse. Just the documentation. The official record simply stops acknowledging what it had previously documented without comment. And when you try to trace what happened, you hit the same wall across every archival source. The Russian Revolution provides convenient cover. Records destroyed, archives burned, institutional memory disrupted. But the pattern appears before 1917. The photographs stop appearing in French and Swedish company records by 1913. German industrial surveys of Siberian resources, which previously included photographic documentation of local labor forces, suddenly omit such images after 1911, as if someone decided these particular workers were no longer appropriate to document, as if their existence became inconvenient to acknowledge. The tools remain, though. The evidence persists in ways that can't be completely erased. Throughout Siberian Russia, antique dealers and rural salvage operations still occasionally uncover the massive implements. Axes with handles measuring 7 feet long, splitting mauls weighing 80 pounds, pike poles extended to lengths that would be completely unmanageable for normal-sized men, all showing wear patterns, all functional tools, not decorative pieces. Local historians categorize them as unclear purpose or possibly ceremonial, despite finding them in contexts that are clearly industrial, buried in old logging sites, recovered from collapsed equipment sheds, unearthed during construction projects in regions with documented timber extraction history. The alternative explanation, that these were everyday tools for workers whose size made such implements practical, remains unspoken in official documentation. Too many questions. Too much disruption to established narratives about who worked in Siberia, who built the infrastructure, who accomplished the industrial feats we've credited to standard historical actors. But the pattern extends beyond just Siberia. Once you know to look for it, you find similar photographic evidence from logging operations across the Russian Far East, throughout the Ural mountain regions, even in northern Scandinavia, where Swedish and Norwegian operations overlapped with Russian territory. Always the same configuration. Work crews containing individuals of extraordinary size performing heavy labor, documented without fanfare, and always stopping around the same period, that crucial window between 1910 and 1920, when something shifted in what was considered acceptable to record. The architecture tells the same story. Workers' housing in remote Siberian settlements from the late 1800s features the same oversized proportions. Doorways built for inhabitants 8 to 10 feet tall, ceiling heights approaching 12 feet in structures that were supposedly temporary worker accommodations, not manor houses, not administrative buildings. Simple timber housing in locations where excess material meant excess labor in brutal conditions. Why build everything larger than necessary unless necessity itself was different than we've assumed? What disturbs me most isn't the evidence itself, it's the systematic refusal to examine it. When you present these photographs to historians of Russian labor, they acknowledge the images are authentic, then dismiss the scale as perspective distortion, without explaining how perspective distorts consistently across hundreds of images from different photographers, different cameras, different decades. When you show the tools to museum curators, they catalog them as unclear industrial use, rather than acknowledge the obvious implication about operator size. When you point out the architectural proportions, you're told they reflect regional building traditions without any explanation of why such traditions would deliberately waste resources making everything too large. It's not active denial, it's passive avoidance. Questions that simply aren't asked because asking them leads places the academic establishment isn't willing to go. But the questions remain. Why did individuals of extraordinary size concentrate in Siberian industrial operations during a specific historical period? Why were they valuable enough to employ despite presumably higher food requirements and specialized equipment needs? Why does their documentation cease precisely when industrialization accelerates and workforce documentation supposedly becomes more sophisticated and comprehensive? And what happened to them? Not gradual demographic decline, not emigration to other regions. There's no corresponding appearance of such individuals elsewhere. Not death from environmental factors. Siberian conditions were harsh for everyone, but these individuals were apparently robust enough for heavy labor in extreme conditions. They just stop appearing in the record, stop being photographed, stop being mentioned, stop existing in official history, as if someone decided they were better forgotten. I keep returning to one photograph in particular. It's dated 1907, taken near Krasnoyarsk during a French timber survey. The image shows a work crew of 10 men with a massive stack of fresh-cut logs. 9 of the men are clearly normal height. You can gauge this by comparing them to a house visible in the frame. One is giant, not a tall man, giant. He's not positioned in front or highlighted in any way. He's simply integrated into the crew, effortlessly holding a log, wearing the same gear. They're colleagues, co-workers, just people doing a job, but we've made them impossible by pretending they never existed. We've turned documented reality into forbidden speculation. We've erased individuals who were apparently unremarkable enough in their own time that photographers saw no need to explain them, and in doing so, we've lost something important. Not just knowledge of who they were, but understanding of what we've forgotten, what capabilities we've lost, what knowledge of human potential existed in recent history that we've somehow decided to ignore. The massive tools remain in salvage yards. The oversized structures still stand in remote locations. The photographs persist in archives, waiting for someone to ask why. Why were they there? Why were they forgotten? And what else have we erased from history because acknowledging it would require rewriting what we think we know about the recent past? The Siberian forests, remember, even if the history books don't. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments which city or country you are from. We would love to know who is watching with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we are creating a community of curious explorers.